Platonism and Christianity, Twilight Session 2020, Session 6, the final session, Mysticism and Christianity as old as creation. Hi guys, as some people might know, the final session didn't work in the recording because we had a bit of a problem with Zoom, and so I thought I'd just sit down here now and put a recording in so that everyone had access to it. So I hope that the volume is working. Yeah, I think it is. So yeah, I just thought I'd record this for those people who missed out or wanted to revise. Yeah, okay. So this week we're talking about mysticism, Platonic mysticism and Christian mysticism, and especially the extent to which one came out of the other. Then we finish by looking at the ways Christianity accounts for its borrowings from other traditions. So, as we might know, Christianity is especially exclusivist. We have the truth. There's this very strong attitude in the tradition that we have the truth and other people don't have it. So it's pagan, it's heresy, it's false. So if Christianity or Judeo-Christianity is the only truth, then how can we borrow from other traditions, declaring that it is Christian when it so evidently is not? So these two topics are related, the mysticism and this story, as we shall see with the first reading. So on the night, Helen did a wonderful reading of the Acts of the Apostles, but I'm just going to read that now. So get that right. So, okay, so we're reading from the Acts of the Apostles, which tells of Paul the evangelist, evangelizing through Greece, taking respite in the world center of Hellenistic philosophy in Athens, while strolling through, hang on a sec. While strolling through Athens, Paul was disturbed to find that the city was full of idols. So he held discussions in the synagogue and every day in the main square with people who happened to come by. Some Epicureans and Stoic teachers debated with him. Some of them asked, "What is this ignorant show-off trying to say?" Others answered, "He seems to be talking about foreign gods." They say this because Paul was preaching about Jesus and the resurrection. They grabbed Paul and took him before the city council, the Areopagus, and said, "We would like to know what this new teaching is, for you bring some strange things to our ears, and we wish to know what they mean." For all folks living in Athens spent their leisure in nothing else but telling and hearing the latest new thing. Paul stood up in front of the council of Areopagus and said, "I see that in every way you Athenians are very religious. For as I walk through your city and look at all the objects you worship, I found an altar dedicated to the unknown God, agnostos theos. Unknowingly, you revere what I announce to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, the Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in man-made temples, nor does he need anything that we can make for him, since it is he himself who gives life and breath and everything else to everyone. From one blood, he created all races of people to dwell across the face of the earth. He himself fixed beforehand the exact time and the limits of the place that we should live. He did this so that they would look for him and perhaps find him as they felt around for him. Yet God is actually not far from any one of us. In him we live and move and have our being. It is as your poets have said, we too are his offspring. Since we are God's offspring, we should not suppose that his nature is anything like an image of gold or silver or stone, shaped by human art and skill. God has overlooked the times when people did not know him. But now he commands all of them, everywhere, repent. For he has fixed the day in which he will judge the whole world, with justice by means of a man he has chosen. He has given proof of this to everyone by raising that man from the dead. When they heard Paul speak about a raising from the dead, some of them made fun of him, but others said, "We want to hear you speak about this again." And so Paul left the meeting. Some men joined him and believed. One of those who went with him was a member of the city council, the Areopagus. His name was Dionysius. And that's the end of the reading from the Acts. So, what's it saying? Paul, the evangelist, is traveling the world, the Hellenistic world, preaching the Gospels, the good news. When he lands in Athens, the home of philosophy, and he's shocked as he wanders through the streets by all the idols, statues of gods, the worship of graven images. While in Athens, Paul, a Jew, does the Jewish thing, and he goes to the synagogue. And there Paul starts evangelizing. Then he does the Greek thing, the Athenian thing, and goes to the agora, where he strikes up conversations to kickstart his evangelizing there. He even debates with Epicurean philosophers, materialists, and Stoic philosophers. Now, these Athenians, they are intellectual trendies, always keen for the latest philosophical fad. So you would think they might be interested to hear the good news about the risen Christ. But no. Instead, Paul gets, this foreign upstart is introducing foreign gods. They drag Paul off to the city council, the Areopagus, for a hearing, a trial, if you would. Will Paul be marched out of town? Or worse? Standing before the council, Paul defends himself with an impromptu speech. Sound familiar? The trial of Socrates, the apology. Paul's apology to the Athenians is more strategic. Unlike Plato, Socrates, remember him poking fun at the wise people of Athens, saying that they didn't know what they were talking about? Not Paul. He tries to connect. He tries to find sympathy. As I walked around your fine street, Paul says, among all these statues to gods, I find your altar to the unknown God, agnostos theos. Unknowingly, your unknown God is the same one I announced to you. My God is no foreign God. He is this very mystical God who does not live in temples, who is not made out of gold or silver. He does not require appeasement through constant sacrifice. He is the God who created the whole world and everything in it, including you and me, all races, Jewish, Greek, all the peoples of the world. Now, this Creator God might be unseen, unknown, mysterious, but he's not remote from us. On the contrary, he is ever present in us as we are in him. And this is just as your poet, Epimenides, said of Zeus. In him we live and move and have our being. That's what Paul quoted. Epimenides was a semi-mythic poet, almost back to the time of Homer. Everyone knew his exaltation of Zeus. They fashioned a tomb for you, Zeus, a holy and high one. But you are not dead. You live and abide forever. For in you we live and move and have our being. Paul is saying, if this is your Zeus, then it is of Zeus that I speak. And the same as the Zeus of Aratus too. For that's the poet Paul was quoting when he said, we too are his offspring. Now, Aratus was another famous poet who everybody knew. Aratus was from around 300 BC, just after Plato. He was like one of these science communicators, David Attenborough, but more like Paul Cox, because Aratus was communicating astronomy. He wrote this famous poem presenting the cosmology of the great mathematician at Plato's Academy, Eudoxus. The poem came out just after Eudoxus had died, and everyone knew it. At least everyone knew it from the start of it, when it opens by saying, everything, the heaven and the earth, including us, all depends on Zeus. Let us begin with Zeus, whom we mortals never leave unspoken. For every street, every marketplace is full of Zeus. Even the sea and the harbour are full of this deity. Everywhere, everyone is indebted to Zeus, for we are his offspring. When Paul quotes, for we are his offspring, he's saying, if this is what you say of your Zeus, then it is of Zeus that I speak. Paul is saying to the Council of Athens, I bring no foreign god. If this is Zeus whom we live in, if this is Zeus who fills the whole cosmos and of whom we are the offspring, then the God of whom I speak is the same as your highest God, Almighty Zeus. It is only that I have come to tell you, and this is my news, my good news. You folks always want the latest news, don't you? This is the bit you need to know. That this God of all, creator of all, he's fixed a day in which he will judge the whole world by means of a man he has chosen, Jesus Christ. How do I know this? God gave a sign. No, God proved it by raising Jesus from the dead. Raising him from the dead, some of those present made fun of him on this last point, but not all. Some were persuaded, converted, and left to follow Paul. One of those was even a member of the council. His name was Dionysus. So then, much later, much later, centuries later, a short essay appears, written in Greek by this very same Dionysius who followed Paul out of the Areopagus Council. The title of this essay is The Mystical Theology. And now, at this point, Vula then read from the beginning of the Mystical Theology, starting with its opening poem. It goes like this. Trinity, higher than any being, any divinity, any goodness. Guide of Christians in the heavenly Sophia. Lead us up beyond unknowing and light, up to the farthest, highest peak of mystic scriptures, where the mysteries of the divine Logos lie simple, absolute, and unchanging in the brilliant darkness of a hidden silence. Amid the deep shadow that pours overwhelming light on what is most manifest. Amid the holy, unsensed, and unseen. They completely fill our sightless mind with treasures beyond all beauty. For this I pray. Dear Timothy, my advice to you, as you look for sight of the mysteries, is to leave behind everything perceived, everything understood, everything perceptible and understandable, all that is and all that is not. Then, with your understanding laid aside, strive upwards as much as you can towards union with Him who is beyond all being and beyond all knowledge. By an undivided and absolute abandonment of yourself and everything, shedding all and freed from all, you will be uplifted to the ray of the divine shadow, which is above everything that is. But hush, be sure that none of this comes to the hearing of the uninformed, those caught up with the things of the world, who imagine that there is nothing beyond the particular being of things. And if initiation into the divine is beyond such people, what of those others, still more uninformed, who describe the transcendent Creator in terms of the lowest order of being? This is what we can actually say about the cause of everything. Since it is the cause of all being, we should ascribe to it all the affirmations we make in regard to beings. And more appropriately, we should negate all these affirmations, since it surpasses all being. Now, we should not conclude that the negations are simply the opposite of affirmations, but rather that the cause of all is considerably prior to this, beyond deficiency, beyond every denial, beyond every affirmation. So that's the end of the reading. Negations that are not simply the opposite of affirmations, but prior to both affirmations and negations. The cause of all being, the cause of all, is beyond all deficiency, beyond every assertion, and every denial. Negative theology, via negativa in the Latin, knowing through denial. These days, folks will get to this stuff, tend to revert to the Greek by calling it apophasis, the apophatic way, the doctrine of learned ignorance, the cloud of the unknowing. What we just read, the mystical theology, was supposed to have been written by Dionysius the Athenian at the Council of Areopagus, who converted to Christianity after hearing Paul the Jew, the foreigner, hauled up before the council. The mystical theology by, as we now say, pseudo-Dionysius, this short text, it's only a few pages, marks the beginning, if ever anything marked the beginning, of Platonic Christian mysticism. The mystical theology first appeared in the 6th century AD. Whoever wrote the work chose the perfect moment in the narrative of apostolic Christianity, this meeting of Christianity and Greek theology, to give Greek mysticism its pseudo-Christian genesis. A convert from the Council of Athens affirms Christianity by way of the highest mystical philosophy. And then how does it mark itself as Christian? It starts with an affirmation of the Trinity. It starts, Trinity, higher than any being. There's no clue why it must be a Trinity here. But given the controversy over the Trinity around that time, it's branding it orthodox. The mystical theology goes on to mention Moses and another disciple, but that is all. There is the divine Logos, but no Jesus. Not the Christ of the Christians, but it's enough. Platonic mysticism has arrived in Christianity. So what's the doctrine taught in the mystical theology? It is that the highest truth is beyond all saying. It cannot be said. It cannot even be denied. This negation is not the opposite of affirmation. It is beyond all contradiction. So this is saying to the logicians, to the Aristotelians, if you stick to your law of contradiction, then you've missed out on the highest truth. God is God and not God, as an unknown unity beyond. How can God be both God and not God? It's illogical. And how can a denial of one and the other give something else again that contains them both? That's illogical. We'll recall the problem of some affirmation, some affirmations in monotheism. God is good. If God is good and God is all, then he must also be bad. God is love. If God is love, then he must also be not love. God is both what he is and what he is not. He is nothing specific. This doctrine goes beyond all specificity because every specificity has a denial. Through renouncing all attachment to specific things, to specific ideas, so that one can come to an encounter with this higher unity. So that's the teaching, but where does it come from? The proximate source is so-called Neoplatonism. The Neoplatonists spoke of the ineffable one, beyond all saying, beyond knowing. These thinkers, especially Platonists in the 3rd century, and then Proclus in the 5th century, considered themselves thoroughly orthodox Platonists. They saw their work as explaining and expounding what Plato had taught. Proclus was, after all, the head of Plato's academy, as it had been reformed and continued long into the Christian era. But these teachers, I should say, came a long time after Plato. Plotinus, 6 centuries after Plato, and Proclus, 2 more centuries later. But is their teaching Platonist or a new Platonism, a Neoplatonism? Now, there's an interesting story here in the modern reception of Plato and Platonism, because Plotinus and his followers were called Neoplatonists, considered to be teaching something new, something novel. They had broken with Plato in significant ways, and especially in terms of their obsession, we might say, with the mystical theology of the transcendental one. Plotinus and co. never saw it this way. Neither did the ancient commentators. In fact, this was a modern misunderstanding of the tradition, especially the esoteric tradition coming out of the academy, but also a misunderstanding of Plato's teaching in the very dialogues. For those who have read the Republic, they'll recall Book 6, where Socrates says that he cannot give an account of the form of forms, the form of the good. He can only say what its offspring, he can only suggest or show what its offspring is through allegory. We will recall the Republic's divided line as a hierarchy of known objects, where sensible things are mere shadows. So, to this is added a corresponding hierarchy of knowing, where the mathematical sciences play a special role in bridging from the sensible to the noetic, from the things to the forms. And this is exemplified by geometric diagrams participating their forms. You know this stuff. You draw a circle, and that circle participates the ideal circle. You draw a square, which shows the principles of squareness, the formal principles, and so forth. But the assumptions or hypotheses of geometry can only go so far, according to Socrates in the Republic. In leading to their forms, they occlude vision of absolute reality, not so dialectic. It advances by destroying the mathematical hypotheses. In a higher discourse detached from all particularity, there can be genuine hypotheses where logos, reason itself, grasped by the power of dialectic, and which leads on to this unhypothetical first principle that Socrates is trying to lead us to in this section. This principle is beyond the being and knowing of all ideas. So too is this metaphysical science leading to it. If the starting point is what is unknown, says Socrates, if the end and what comes in between is woven together out of what is unknown, then what means are there that such a set of hypotheses can ever become knowledge? This very practice is a paradox. As for its method, there are few hints in the Republic, but for that we need to go to later dialogues where Plato presents his engagement with the ancient masters of paradox, Eleatic skeptics. Through their attempts to destroy all pretensions to knowledge, Plato finds a way to this unknown source. Now, we might remember Parmenides. We mentioned him earlier. how he defended the outrageous claim that only one is. In Plato's Parmenides, in the dialogue, we have Parmenides showing Socrates how the higher dialectic is done by way of perfect contradiction. Plato's Parmenides defends pairs of contradictory hypotheses, two pairs based on his claim that only one is, then another two based on its negation, that this one is not. Then, with barely a reference to sensible things, Parmenides comes to some perplexing conclusions. And check these out. One cannot be anywhere, for it could not be either in anything or in itself. One is neither changing nor unchanging. One cannot be either other or the same to itself or another. The one will neither be like nor unlike either other or itself. The one is not at all. It turns out that these very statements are used by Plotinus and the Neoplatonists. This was pointed out by E.R. Dodds in 1928, and then suddenly modern scholars realized what seems so obvious now, that Plato was already Neoplatonist. Plato already had the mystical one. The mystical theology is already taught in Plato's dialogues in his engagement with the masters of apophatic method and the apophatic method, the masters of contradiction, the Eleatics, Parmenides and Zeno. Only Plato built from their skepticism a philosophical foundation in a mysticism. Now, we won't go into this mysticism very much today. That's kind of like a whole new exercise. I'm just giving you an outline of where it's heading. But what I wanted to do to finish off with is to give you a bit of an account of the tradition, because much of this tradition, this mystical tradition in the West, the Platonic mystical tradition especially, has been largely forgotten, and people tend to turn to the East. So the method of mystical theology, which points to the Neoplatonistic mystical one, is already in Plato, as we said. Now that we know this, let's trace from there. But we probably should mention, of course, where the term comes from. Before Plato, there were the mystery cults. Mysteria comes from references to what was taught in these secret mystery cults. So then we come to Plato and his engagement with Parmenides and Zeno, and with followers of followers of Parmenides. So that's in Parmenides and in the Sophists. Then we have this long period of Middle Platonism, which is almost lost. And we can see fragments of this teaching there. Then we get these texts, which are called Neoplatonism. We get Plotinus and his way of desire for union with the mystical one. And as an aside, guess where Plotinus went to school? What city? You guessed it, Alexandria, of course. But he was a student with the famous Platonist called Ammonius. And guess who was his fellow student at that school? So Plotinus went to school with, went to Plato's school with the famous Christian patriarch, Origen of Alexandria, who we've mentioned earlier in the allegorical, when we were talking about allegorical interpretations of the Christian canon. We should also say that Proclus, so he came later in the 5th century, and the Neoplatonists directly influenced Augustine. That's wrong. Proclus was after Augustine. Plotinus directly influenced St. Augustine. Next in line in the mystical tradition is Proclus in the 5th century, who also studied in Alexandria but ended up in Athens running the re-established academy 800 years after the original was founded by Plato. Proclus is the most apparent influence on pseudo-Dionysus. Now, we should say that the clever plan to introduce Platonic mysticism by this author, whoever he or she was, didn't work so well at first. It was picked up very slowly in Christianity. We do know that in the 9th century, in the Carolingian period, just after Charlemagne, that John the Scot translated it from the Greek. Now, what's interesting about John the Scot is not only that he was Irish, but that Ireland was rather backward at the time. They were still teaching ancient Greek. Elsewhere in Western Europe, they had given that up long ago. But because the Irish knew it and because John knew it, he was able to translate it for Charles the Bald, the successor to Charlemagne, the founder of the Holy Roman Empire. But the true revival of Platonic mysticism came in the 13th and especially 14th century with an amazing spiritual revival, spiritual God within and all that in Western Europe. In the Rhineland, there was the famous churchman Meister Eckhart. Before him, the spiritual revival that influenced him can be traced back, although with very little evidence. And the reason for this is a persistent, thorough, extreme, and very successful persecution by the church authorities. There was the so-called free spirit movement, which seems to be very much like Sufism in my reading. And there was this movement of female mystics, the Beguines, who retreated to live in hovels in the forest, of which we know precious little. But then there's the remarkable story of Marguerite Poretti. We know that she wrote this book called The Mirror of Simple Souls, a dialogue between reason and love, where love triumphs in a transcendence of the contradictions of reason, where the aspirant reaches an erotic union with the divine. Written in the vulgar tongue, Old French, Marguerite's book seems to have been very popular, copiously copied and circulated in secret. Of course, as with the whole spiritual revival, the inward spiritual path threatened the authority of priestly mediation to the divine, and so it threatened the spiritual authority, the political authority of the church. Marguerite's book was banned. When copies were discovered, they were piled up and ceremoniously burned, as was poor old Marguerite. She was caught, imprisoned, refused to recant, and then in 1310, tied to a stake in the main square of Paris and burned alive. The persecution was so successful that her book was entirely lost. But then, in 1946, someone sifting through the piles of decaying manuscripts in the Vatican Library found a Latin translation. And then, in 1965, a complete Middle French version showed up and was published and then translated into English. And so you can get hold of this in the Classics of Western Spiritualism has an edition of The Mirror of Simple Souls. So do get hold of it if you can. And they also have Pseudo-Dionysus. There's other writings by Pseudo-Dionysus and the mystical theologies in there. Okay, so anyway, so then after these begging women, they seem to have influenced Meister Eckhart. There is some evidence and discussion of that by scholars. But Meister Eckhart is the most famous and has been down through the years. It's the most famous Platonic mystic of the 14th century, drew large crowds to his sermons that gave mystical interpretations of scriptures. He had a surprisingly good run, but was eventually accused of heresy only to avoid persecution through an early death. This spiritual revival extended across the Channel, with perhaps the most famous anonymous text, the cloud of the unknown. The cloud of unknowing, I should say. This movement continued right up to the reformer Martin Luther in Germany, who as a young man was influenced by a student of Eckhart's, John Tauler. But Luther developed a great disdain for the mystical theology. And even as the 14th and 15th century spiritual revival drove the Reformation, Luther and the Lutherans, Calvin and the Calvinists were successful in killing it off. Finally, we must mention the more scientific strain of this mystical tradition. And this includes one of my favorites, Nicholas of Cusa. He was of the 15th century, the early 15th century, and is often considered to be of the early Renaissance. But that's not really the Florentine Renaissance. It's not the Renaissance of Platonism, because actually he had great difficulties in getting good translations of Plato. So, but then there was the Florentine Renaissance. And in Florence, the mystical theology was revived, retranslated, and reunited, re-engaged, if you like, with Plato through Marsilio Ficino and his friends in the Platonic Academy of Florence. The only thing was that they still believed the story of the mystical theology, that it was written by Dionysus, by the very Dionysus who was converted by Paul at that council in Athens. And so they thought that the Neoplatonists were borrowing from Dionysus and not the other way around. Which brings us to our final discussion of the way that non-Christian ideas were justified as being, or believed to be, incorporated into this exclusivist narrative of Christianity. Okay, so then in class, I went on to do that, what is listed as the final session on our website, which is Christianity as Old as Creation. And this is really all about this problem of exclusivism in Christianity. Like, first of all, you've got to work out, what is the Christian teaching? Well, it's not just what Jesus says in the Gospels, is it, right? It expands out to teachings that are taken from other parts of the Bible and the Old Testament. But how do you create a dogma from that? And how do you bring it all together? And what exactly is the teaching? And how do you include teachings or systematic teachings that are borrowed from elsewhere? Well, we've already mentioned the importance of Philo the Jew from Alexandria. So he's a Hellenistic Jew, insignificant in the history of Judaism, because Hellenistic Platonism basically died out, but very important for the Christians. And that's why we know him today. Philo introduced the idea that philosophy is a preparation for the divine revelation of Christianity. And he used that allegory, he used Ishmael and Hagar and Ishmael story to explain the role of philosophy. He sees all wisdom coming out of the Jewish tradition, that all pagan wisdom comes from the Jewish tradition, and only perhaps it is corrupted. So even philosophy comes out of the Jewish tradition. It's a preparation for the genuine revelation, but it still comes out of it. It's all connected. There's no foreign sources. So it might have to be, if it's coming from, maybe it's coming from the Egyptians, then it's coming from Moses. If it's before then it's coming from Abraham, and so on. And this set the trend for the Christian apologists to say that all wisdom came from our tradition, this Judeo-Christian tradition. And so in this way, they will be able to claim all wisdom for themselves. Now, one of the first patriarchs, quite early on, just early in the 2nd century, was Justin Martyr. And he had an interesting story. He was a Stoic, first of all. He was into Stoicism. Then he became a Platonist, and only then became a Christian. And this was a common path, as we'll see. He identified the divine logos of Greek philosophy with the Son, Sophia, and the incarnate Jesus Christ. Truth was one and proceeded from the same source, whether it was expressed by Moses or by Heraclitus. He said, "We are taught that Christ is the firstborn of God, and we have shown that he is the Logos of whom the whole human race partakes. And those who live according to the Logos are Christians, even though they are accounted atheists, such as Socrates or Heraclitus." And he says somewhere else, "I declare that I prayed and strove with all my might to be found a Christian, not because the teachings of Plato are contrary to those of Christ, but because they are not in all respects like them." Later he says, "Whatever has been uttered aright by any man in any place belongs to us Christians. For all the writers were able to see this truth darkly through the implanted seed of Logos dwelling in them." So after Justin Martyr, we get the Alexandrian fathers. The earliest, Clement of Alexandria. So he was again in the 2nd and then into the 3rd century. And he said, "Thus philosophy was necessary to the Greeks for righteousness until the coming of the Lord. And now it assists towards true religion as a kind of preparatory training for those who arrive at faith by way of revelation." Okay, so we're already starting here to get this distinction between what then became revealed religion, what you get from Jesus, the new revelation, and the old revelations prior to Jesus. So the prophets, direct line from God in the text, that's revealed religion. But you also get this other religion, which is being expressed here as preparatory to this revealed religion, and that is includes Greek philosophy. And so it has this role, even this important role, in the tradition. It may be that philosophy was given to the Greeks immediately and primarily until the Lord should call the Greeks, for philosophy was a schoolmaster to bring the Greek mind to Christ, as the law brought the Hebrews. Philosophy was a schoolmaster to bring the Greek mind to Christ, as the law brought the Hebrews. Thus, philosophy was a preparation, paving the way towards perfection in Christ. So that's Clement. This was the general teaching that came to be seen coming out of a kind of reading of Paul, where God prepared for the coming of his Son through institution of the law, the Torah, for the Jews, and through philosophy with the Greeks. So the law prepared the Jews and philosophy prepared the Greeks. Now let's move on to the time of Constantine, the emperor, when he started taking up Christianity and approving it as the religion of empire, or the preferred religion of empire. And we get in the Trinitarian dispute. Remember, there was Arius in Alexandria. Well, his main opponent was Athanasius. And he was also in Alexandria, and he was rewarded after Nicaea with promoted to become the Patriarch of Alexandria. But he was not a strongly conservative Christian exclusivist. He had a rather extreme view that the incarnation of the Son and his new revelation was a backup to what could be learned by natural philosophy. The revelations of the Christ are only to recall what had been lost or ignored. He seemed to be saying that the incarnation of Christ as Jesus is a compensation for those who are unwilling to know God, or who were lured away by other things. Now, there's also Eusebius, who famously wrote the history of the church. So he was in the generation, the Nicene generation, in the early 4th century, and this is well worth reading, the history of the church, to get a bit of a vibe of Christianity at the time. It's very Hellenistic and very Platonist. Okay, so so one of the things about Eusebius is that one of the things that Eusebius was trying to address was also addressed by Origen in his Contra Celsum against a pagan critic, a Platonist critic of Christianity, and Eusebius has the same apology for Christianity, which is against the accusation that it's novel, that it's this new thing, that these ignorant Christians, who are probably very uneducated, were pushing this new religion that didn't really have a deep philosophical understanding and didn't have a deep philosophical pedigree in history. So Eusebius argued against this, that Christianity is no novelty, that it actually, he was showing, and he goes back through history, how the divine logos of Christianity has revealed itself to all sorts of folks, Greek and Jew, since time immemorial. Only sometimes these folks were not able or willing to listen or understand, he says. Thus, in conclusion, he says, thus the practice of religion, as communicated to us by Christ's teachings, is shown to be not modern and strange, but in all conscience, primitive, unique, and true. Christianity as old as creation. Now, what I was starting to explain earlier emerged later. Which is this difference between, more strongly later anyway, this difference between revealed theology and natural theology, or what became called later natural religion. So the revealed theology came out of the revelations of the Christ, and the other revelations in Christianity, and then the natural theology comes from basically the sources of philosophy, comes from reason and sense, reason, sense, and nature. And this is taken to have its biblical source in Paul's letter to the Romans, where he says, that which may be known of God is manifest in them. And by them he means in the Gentiles. For God has shown it to them, the Gentiles. For the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and divine nature. Paul is saying that God can be known not only by revelation, by the revelation of Christ, but by studying creation, by the invisible things can be known in this way, the invisible things of God, the visible, invisible through the visible, even God's eternal power and divine nature. Now this, of course, reminds us of Plato, where the sensible things, invisible things, partake in the forms, and the way you're reminded of the forms through sensible reality. So it's a similar kind of philosophy. We should say that Paul of the letters is not so sympathetic with philosophy. He's certainly perhaps competitive with it. And there is a big tirade against philosophy in the first letter of the Corinthians. It makes some folks wonder whether, and this and other aspects of Paul in the Acts of the Apostles compared to Paul in the letters, they seem so very different that it makes people wonder whether in fact it is the same Paul. Okay, so then quite late in the 4th century, after Nicaea, we get St. Augustine. I mentioned he's Latin. He was from Africa, but he went to Rome, very much in the Latin Church as it starts forming separate from the Eastern Church. And we find him with the difficulty of how to account for the marvelous similarity of Plato's inspired theology with the true one revealed by the Christ. Now remember, Christian theology had already developed at this point to be more Platonic. So this became especially problematic when he did some historical investigations, and he had to reject the prevailing traditional explanation. He had followed Justin, Eusebius, and the Alexandrian fathers into teaching that Plato had read the Jewish scriptures and or met the prophet Jeremiah. But this theory had no historical credibility for Augustine, and so he abandoned it together with the idea of historical transmission. So if the book was closed and Plato was not in it, nor did he have access to it, then how did he come to know these divine Christian mysteries? In his City of God, big book, that's a great book, Augustine came up with his idea of natural theology, that this is the method of the Platonists, concluding that none came nearer to Christianity than the Platonists because they extended natural theology beyond the visible world, beyond the world soul, by acknowledging a God that transcends all, the mystical one of the Platonists. Elsewhere, he says that if the Platonists could have had this life over again with us, they would have become Christians with the change of a few words and statements. Platonism is basically Christianity. The division between revealed and natural religion then became the axis upon which the debate turned. To what extent can one know God through reason and nature alone without revelation? This went right through to the 18th century when some followers of the philosopher John Locke, who pushed a revival of materialist correspondence theory of truth, as we talked about in our introductory course. So John Locke, one of the founders of the Enlightenment philosophy, turning back towards Aristotle, he had these followers called deists, who were called deists. It was called deism, who said, we don't need this revelation because Christianity can all be deduced through reason. Through reason and nature, we don't even need the Bible, and we don't need these priests. So of course it was problematic and heretical. Now, when we come to the, so that's going forward, that was in the 18th century. But if we go back to the Renaissance, then there was this revival of this idea of one long ancient tradition, the perennial philosophy. So this account where if you see wisdom in the Greeks, if you see it in the East, if you see it in Egypt or whatever, it's because it comes from our tradition. So this view that the ancient tradition of revealed religion perhaps secretly was transmitted down through the ages. This might be sometimes called the ancient theology. These days among scholars, I notice that it's often called the perennial philosophy, the philosophy that's always been there and always transmitted. In the Christian version, it had to be linked to the Judeo-Christian narrative. And so if any great tradition of wisdom was found, it had to have come from Moses. If not from Moses, then from Abraham. If not from Abraham, then from Noah. And then if not from Noah, if it was really old, then it came from the original teachings of God to Adam in the Garden of Eden. Now, there's a fascinating story that came very late in the Renaissance. Indeed, it wasn't the Renaissance, but it's a story that is still where the people involved were still thinking in that Renaissance way. And these were the Jesuits in ancient China. The Jesuit missionaries to China. And people might know that it was very hard. It's always been very hard to break into China, break into the Chinese markets, and also to break in terms of evangelizing the religion. But the Jesuits succeeded after incredible efforts to be allowed into Peking, to be allowed into the court of the Emperor of China. And they had this marvelous idea that, well, remember how the Emperor Augustine was converted? And look what happened then to Christianity. Well, maybe we can do the same thing in China. Anyway, some of these Jesuits had this idea. This was just after Newtonian astronomy was taking off. And they had this idea that modern mathematical science, which they saw as united with Christianity, they didn't see any difference, that they could promote Christianity and show the power of Christianity through this modern mathematical science. And they persuaded the French king, this is late in the 17th century, to send a party of Jesuit mathematicians, a mission of mathematicians to China, so that they could then teach this marvelous science and then convert everyone. The only trouble was these scientists learned the ancient script and started reading the old texts of the very long tradition of Chinese wisdom, and especially those texts around the Book of Change, the I Ching. And what did they find? Christianity. The Chinese already had it, only it had been corrupted and mostly lost down through the ages. But how did they get it? So they had this idea that the third son of Noah had traveled to the east. Well, we knew that in the Bible. The third son of Noah traveled to the east. And the Chinese had this tradition that the founder of the first dynasty, the so far mythical founder, there seems to be no evidence yet of this dynasty, the first founder of the dynasty came from the west. Noah's third son went to the east. The founder of this dynasty, who started off this tradition, the I Ching tradition, came from the west. So they had this idea that the third son of Noah was in fact the founder of this tradition in China. So China was already Christian, just a little bit corrupted. So you just had to revive their own tradition. Well, this was very Jesuit, accommodationism it was called, and not everyone back home agreed with it. And the fellow missionaries in other orders didn't agree with it either. And so this sympathy with the local tradition was heavily censored and eventually silenced. And in fact, later in the 18th century, the Pope totally disbanded the Jesuits, and they were gone for many decades. So this shows the bind that Christianity was in with its exclusivism and how it tried to overcome this bind. If it followed anything good from outside its gambit, it had to either show that it was actually Christian or reject it as pagan heresy. Okay, so that's pretty much the course there. And yeah, so it's been great having everyone, and I hope some people do listen to this recording eventually, so that we've got a nice complete set. But I'll just do a quick summary of the story of Platonism and Christianity just to finish off. Okay, so Christianity started within Hellenistic Jewish culture 3 centuries after Alexander's conquest. It seems to have begun with the historical Jesus and his enthusiastic, perhaps apocalyptic, or maybe that came later, following. Now, then they struck disaster. Their leader was convicted and killed by the Roman state. The oral and textual tradition seems to have begun with collections of the sayings of Jesus, including the parables, the allegories. And this developed into, these gospels developed into with more and more biographical detail and also interpretations of the parables. The letters of Paul are the earliest documents of the church. But Paul evangelized especially to the Greeks, and especially in the Acts of the Apostles, we find him expressing sympathy with Greek philosophy. The crushing of the Jewish insurrections. So there were insurrections against the Romans, and the crushing of these seemed to have a huge impact on early Christianity, especially the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. The Gospel of John seems to be late, maybe even after this, and it introduces a more philosophical, so Platonist, Stoic account of Jesus. After the Apostolic Age comes the Church Patriarchs. Starting early with Justin of Martyr, there is this very strong sympathy with Greek philosophy, as we've just seen today in those quotes I read out. What is new for Greek philosophy in Christianity is the same as what is new for the Jews. That is the revelations of Jesus Christ and his death and resurrection. Greek doctrines of the soul and the afterlife start to enter the Christian discourse, and the Alexandrian fathers especially follow the Hellenistic Jew Philo of Alexandria and apply allegorical interpretations as a way of incorporating Hellenistic philosophy, Platonism, Stoicism into the Christian doctrine and the Christian stories, myths. After that time, Emperor Constantine favored Christianity, and Christianity went from actually a period of persecution into a period when it was privileged in the empire. And then there was attempt to dogmatize the Platonic Stoic doctrine of the divine creator that especially is given an account of in that prologue to John's Gospel. And in this dogmatization, as we saw, it was corrupted and it became the ever controversial doctrine of the. But interestingly, even after this period, when things started to get dogmatized quite seriously, they tried to get one sort of church, one doctrine, one creed. Platonism continued to influence Christianity through folks like Augustine, who was originally who was a Platonist before he became a Christian, and then also through other folks who had a similar journey like that, like the Cappadocian Fathers. So a lot of these folks had a philosophical background, then converted to Christianity, and then tended to bring their philosophy with them. So this was going on for quite some time, and it wasn't until really the 5th and 6th century that the Christian exclusivism started to really come down heavily on philosophy. Philosophy was persecuted, and eventually the pagan schools were closed down in Athens and in Alexandria and elsewhere. Christianity, especially in the West, started to forget its philosophical roots, and there was that barrier of language where the Latin became the language of Christianity in the West. However, there was a spiritual revival, a rebellion, a persecuted rebellion in the 14th century, and it is quite evidently, there's evidence quite evidently influenced by Platonic mysticism. Then in the 15th century came the Renaissance of Greek philosophy and pagan mythology and a renewed interest in natural science, which was revived in the model of Platonism as a devotional practice aspiring towards unity with the divine. Think of Leonardo da Vinci, think of Ficino, and then later on think of Kepler, and later on after that, Leibniz. This approach was crushed and marginalized by the Reformation. Then there was the Enlightenment. Remember I mentioned John Locke. In this revival of science, where it attempted to get to be state sanctioned, it was painted Aristotelian as not threatening the spiritual authority of the church. And this attitude to science, looking down to material things rather than looking up to the divine forms, this science as completely separate from religion, continued, this image of science continued on until our times as a completely different practice. So very different from the approach in Platonism of the Renaissance and earlier. So that's where we are now. And so hopefully we have a better picture of Platonism's role in Christianity up until our time, perhaps less so recently, but perhaps we can see the echoes of it in modern Christianity. Okay, so thank you everyone. I can't take any questions now, but I will close the video and hopefully see you guys in some other classes at the Platonic Academy of Melbourne. Okay, so I will say Merry Christmas and Happy New Year.